The Wespenra Papers, the second level of learning. Genesis Paper Number 2, War of the Titans and the Destruction of Original Terra by Wespenra, Sunday, July 29, 2012, revised, Tuesday, July 31, 2012, http://wespenry.com. 1. The end of the Golden Age. Millions of years later, while there still was a Golden Age on Terra, and the experiment went per the plan, the Queen made the famous peace agreement with the Syrian king, the Khanis Khanar. Part of the agreement included that the Syrian king would get control over parts of Sector 9 but would have to stay away from Peshmetan, the ninth passageway. Unfortunately, our solar system, Eridu, was part of the agreement. The Queen's empire was teeming with life and experiments were pending in many places. The idea of the living library was only one of a lot of different ideas and experiments. It may appear that it didn't occur to the Queen when the agreement was made that the Syrian lords would disturb the development of species and/or interfere with their business and development. In addition, even if the Syrians now were in command over certain sections of the Milky Way galaxy, they were still part of the Orion Empire, per the agreement, so also Eridu. Even when so, each race in any solar system is supposed to reign themselves in sovereignty while abiding the laws of the Orion Empire, so long as they won't afflict on their rights to free will. Nowhere in the contract did it say that the Syrian king could interfere with a pending experiment, but apparently it didn't say they couldn't, either. Did the Queen make a terrible mistake when she made up the contract? Did she leave that part out because it goes unsaid? There is probably a more plausible answer to what happened. Both the Syrians and the Queen were well aware of the universal laws, and the law of non-interference in particular in this case. That is not something you need to put in a contract that part goes unsaid. However, if a star race, such as the Syrians, managed to manipulate another star race into agreeing with them and to have them do something they wouldn't agree with normally, if they knew the full consequences, the star race, the Syrians in our example, could potentially bypass the law of non-interference and refer to the law of free will. They could justify their actions by saying, "We didn't do it." They did. They agreed to do it. And this was exactly what happened. There is a long story of inner conflicts among the Syrian kings and the members of their royal court, which we are not going to go into in details here. It's been documented by other researchers, such as Robert Morning Sky. Briefly, to make the reader get the picture, the Asur, another name for the Syrian kings, were very possessive, and power and greed ruled their existence, both on a royal level as well as among regular citizens of their society. Sons and grandsons constantly overthrew their parents and grandparents from the throne, or sons overthrew their own fathers in family businesses. Coups were very common, so common that a sitting king would very rarely remain in power for long before he was overthrown and either killed or exiled. Such behavior, I have learnt, continue up to this day. The problem is that things were rarely getting better for the average Syrian citizen in spite of whom was in power. Where have we seen that before? Isn't that how it is here on Earth? It didn't take long before the Syrian king put troops and scientists to explore these parts of his new domains. It was very strategically located, and the Eridu solar system was only a few billion years old, which meant it had a lot of potentials, not the least as a military, strategic outpost. The problem was that this solar system was sitting in the middle of Peshmetan, and the Syrians had promised not to interfere with this huge, commercial highway. However, as the great Khanis, whom some call King Anu, saw himself and his people as heirs to this universe after have signed the peace treaty with the Queen of the Stars. And after all, this is a free will universe, and he could do whatever he pleased. Yes, an action always brings on a counteraction, but he was too powerful not to be able to handle whatever came in his way, he thought. And what made the Queen think she was more powerful than him, anyway? He, too, could travel the Khaa. And who else than the great King Anu could decide the destiny of his people better than him? No other Syrian kings, despite of which occupied star system they ruled over, dared to challenge him. How could they? So he was determined to do whatever he thought would be the best for the expansion of his people, Peshmetan or not. And I am smart, he smiled. I can manipulate anyone or anything to dance to my flute. In the long run, even the Queen of the Stars will dance. For eons, the Syrian overlords had conquered the universe, and they had always done it the same way. At one point in time, before they even realized that the universe is feminine, and once they started traveling the Khaa, they noticed that the universe, to nourish itself, let other beings go out and create and bring back food sources to it. By experiencing things, the universe grew and expanded in certain ways, just like you and I do when we eat nutritious food we get more energy. When the Syrians realized this, they thought they could do the same and perhaps one day become bigger than the universe itself. However, they noticed that they in particular, due to their nature, loved to feed off a certain frequency of the electromagnetic spectrum more than anything else, and that small frequency band was one that was based on fear. They loved to feed off of fear. When they did, they felt powerful and energetic, like they could conquer anything. It was like a drug to them. And they ate the flesh of their enemies and drank their blood. That was not only because of some strange adrenaline rush while at war, but they fed off the fear that was induced in the dying enemy. This is also why, in dire times, they eat their young and drink their blood, too. It gives them more life energy and more potentials to survive. The Syrians had been absolutely convinced they could conquer anything, until they encountered the Aryans. It took time for the Khanas Connor to get over the first shock after he realized that he'd met his superiors, a star race he hadn't been able to defeat. But after the peace treaty he had started plotting. He realized that being in alliance with the Queen could be a great beneficial factor for him and his people when comes to conquering the universe. He understood that most developed star races looked at Orion as the most evolved empire in this part of the universe, and if the Syrian king could be associated with them, he certainly got some free promotion and advertisement. Then, he at one point could outsmart the queen and perhaps even the mother goddess herself, who would ever dream of standing up against him again. And with life elixirs and everything, he could live a long time. So, due to that the Queen basically left him alone to explore and exploit as much as he wanted of the universe, and even gave him a sector of unexplored space as his own domain. The great Syrian king could, just for now, continue conquering the universe the way he and his ancestors had always done, by locking conquered world into a small frequency band based on fear, and feed off the terror they created in the living species on a particular world they had conquered. We humans call this small frequency band the third dimension. The Syrians themselves were sexual beings who reproduced by sexual means, but even in their own world they fed off each other's fear, and those on top of the totem pole were the ones who got the most food. The rest worked their ways through a hierarchical structure. They realized that, on conquered worlds it was a good idea to create sexual beings who could reproduce and multiply. Depending on the circumstances, the Syrians gained from letting the species that they'd conquered multiply and become many in numbers. The more people, the greater food source. There was sometimes a problem with this, however. The more people on a conquered planet, the harder it was to keep the population under control. Even with their sophisticated hologramic equipment that they used to keep their slaves under their thumb, and which kept the victims within the narrow 3D frequency band, the numbers also made it possible for some of the entrapped souls to break out of the prison, and sometimes the Syrians had to become very clever to manipulate a huge population into staying in the frequency of fear. When they found it almost impossible to do so, they had no choice but to vastly reduce the population of a planet. So King Anu sent his military over to Eridu, led by his son, whom is known as Lord Enlil here on Earth, to explore the solar system and exploit its resources to add to the riches of the kings of the Syrian Empire, and perhaps to make his son king of Eridu one day. Anu knew he had to send a percentage of the resources they exploited to Orion as a part of the business deal, but hopefully there should be enough for everybody. The Syrian expedition split up and explored the planets in this young solar system, one by one. The scientists, who were in charge of the expedition, named the different bodies in the Eridu system mostly in Aryan language due to that this was the official language spoken in the Aryan Empire. The Syrian lords parked their hollowed-out planetoid at some distance from Terra and descended to the beautiful, giant planet beneath, splitting up in different teams. 2. What are these beings doing on my planet? The Namlu were somewhat used to visitors due to that different star races had come and left over the last million years to take part of the knowledge from the living library. Some of these star races had even built colonies on Terra and stayed there with the Titans' permission. The Namlu had been very lucky, because thus far, the visitors to Terra had been benevolent and very respectful, as it should be. They had always asked for permission to come, and the humanoid guardians of the living library had always granted them, and so had the Titan administrators. There had been no reason not to. After all, that's what the living library was for. Many star races from far away knew about Terra, but the Syrian lords did not. This may sound odd, but the Syrians had still been an exploring star race before they hit the walls of the Orion Empire and knew next to nothing about what was beyond their empire. Not until they had been assigned a certain subsector of Sector 9 had they started showing interest in the star systems they now had been permitted to explore. There were many races in the universe who were more evolved than the reptilian lords, but few were as ruthless. Suddenly a group of Namlu felt the presence of a new type of beings nearby. Before they could even see them, they felt their energies. Their bodies turned reddish, because they felt uneasy by this new energy. It was more zigzag-like, and not as smooth as they were used to from other star races. The humanoid shepherds soon stood face to face with these peculiar newcomers. The Namlu were tall and slender, but this visiting star race was short and stubby. This in itself was perhaps not so strange, because the Namlu had met many different kinds of beings over the millennia. But these dwarf-like beings were different. What they felt from these visitors was alertness, surprise, but most of all, hostility. This was something the Namlu had never experienced before, not to this extent. They were a little confused. The tall humans waited for some communication from the visitors, but they were only chattering between themselves. The humanoids found it strange that for some reason, this dwarf race seemed to block their energies so that the Namlu couldn't read them. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they left. The Namlu were surprised, but sure the visitors would return soon. They looked at each other but then didn't give it a second thought and just went on with their business. There were some animals nearby who needed their attention. Other groups of Syrians were met by a tall species of reptilian humanoids, most of them females, who also had with elongated skulls. The overlords recognized them immediately as being Aryans, and not only that, they were royalty, they could tell. The Syrians knew they were Titans, daughters of the Queen, and the rest of their people were of the same species as the Queen original Aryans. The Titans welcomed the overlords like old friends, knowing that they were now part of the Orion Empire. The overlords were shocked to find the Titans here on their world, but kept a polite conversation, saying they were on a mission and that the Titans were soon to speak with someone of higher authority. Then they left. On board the Syrian planetoid-sized spacecraft, they welcomed the expedition teams back from the visit to the misty world below. Lord Enlil called for an immediate meeting, also with the top scientists present. Everybody told of their experiences down on the surface of Terra, and the head scientist collected the data and summarized what he had learned. Apparently, this planet had been seeded with life forms of all different kinds in a distant past. The oceans as well as the land masses were inhabited with a myriad of different species in an abundance seldom seen before. In actuality, the Syrian overlords had never experienced a world with so much variety. Most of the teams who had been sent down to the surface had encountered a very tall and thin species that walked around naked, clearly androgynous. They walked around carrying sticks, acting like some kind of shepherds for the domestic animals. Very strange. This star race wouldn't be a problem for them, they concluded, and perhaps the scientists could use them in the future to create a more intelligent race that they could enslave and feed off. They seemed too fragile to be used for any harder labor, though. For now, they were just written off as domestic savages. Little did they understand about this highly intelligent, multidimensional species. Now, there was something else that really upset the Syrians with this visit and was much more urgent than the shepherds. Terra was the perfect world to use as the headquarters of Eridu and perhaps the whole sector that they had been assigned by the Queen. And best of all, this whole solar system was perfectly located, strategic-wise. It was also a perfect world in the sense that it had tons of resources they could exploit, gold and precious metals in particular, and trade it with other star races, or use themselves. Enlil told his generals and admirals that his father, King Anu, would not be happy to hear about the Titans, though. How dared the Queen put her administrators on his world? Enlil used a stargate to communicate back to Sirius, where King Anu was sitting in his palace. He told the king about the situation with the Titans, and true enough, the king got upset. Actually, he was upset enough to decide to immediately come to Eridu himself to check out the situation. So he boarded Ar, the royal ship, which in usual Syrian manner was a hollowed-out craft, and went to Eridu together with his personal guards and some extra military. King Anu was in a very bad mood when he arrived. He saw the Titans as part of an Aryan intrusion. His face turned red and he said, furiously, "What are these beings doing on my planet? We need to get rid of them. I need to talk to the Queen, this is ridiculous." Terra was his planet and he could do whatever he pleased with it. And the last thing he wanted was to have an intelligent race strutting around on his world, following his every move. He had enough of that from being married to the Queen. His first instinct was to terminate them all. King Anu pulled his fingers through his beard while he was considering what to do. He looked at all the people present in the room, one by one, and said, "Why would I consult the Queen? The Titans are her representatives here. I want to talk to them, and I want them to leave our planet within a week." Everybody in the room all nodded in agreement. After all, why would the king consult the Queen? This was his territory and he didn't need to bow down to anybody. He was King Anu, the Khanas Khanar, and after have signed the peace agreement, he looked upon himself and his people as the heirs to the universe. The Queen had given him this sector of the universe, so why had she put administrators on his planet? The king leaned back and then slammed his fist on the arm of his chair. "So be it. Do whatever is necessary to make these damn Titans cooperate. Also, I want a royal palace built on this planet in my honor, an exact copy of the one back in Sirius. I want it built on the top of that tall mountain over there." King Anu pointed at the monitor inside the spaceship, which could, by putting in coordinates into a computer, show any part of the planet, and one of the operators zoomed in a huge mountain, rising towards the sky, having 52 peaks. This would become the famous Mount Olympus, where the gods once dwelled. Then we need people to help us dig out the mines in the southern hemisphere. Let's get some workforce from home and let's get going. Take me down there so I can check things out. I want to see where the gold is. We need the gold. Let's start with checking out the mines, and after that I want to have a serious talk with the administrators of this place. This meeting is over. Anu was especially interested in the gold, because gold had a profound effect on the Syrians. Although the Queen gave them Esma-Def as well, the king doubted that the Queen would be very cooperative with him and his people in the future, after he had told the Titans to go, and he and his people may lose the right to take the liquid. If so, gold would do. They had found that if they snorted it, similar to how we snort cocaine, it had a similar effect as the Esma, although not as powerful. They lived longer if they took the Queen's substance. For the first, but not the last time, King Anu descended down to planet Terra and visited the mines and instructed his people what to do. Then they took him on a sightseeing in one of their domestic ships, and suddenly, he stood eye to eye with the Titans. They knew who he was, so they greeted him as an Aryan and welcomed him and his people to the planet. The king explained that he was on a trip, checking out different Syrian colonies to see what needed to be done. He further told the Titans that his people will be back to do some mining in the southern hemisphere soon to extract some minerals and precious stones. However, this was his territory and he wanted the Titans to leave the planet as soon as possible. The Titans took the king to Mount Othris, which was the Titanic Palace, and their headquarters, where the daughters of the Queen sat. King Anu was led in front of the 7 top administrators, where he and his generals could express their concerns. And the king did. His fury was extraordinary, and his deep baritone voice echoed through the halls of the palace. He demanded that the palace was given to him, and that the Titans leave the planet faster than soon. The Titans remained calm and told the king that although Terra could be considered Syrian territory per the peace agreement, it still belonged to the Aryan Empire per the same agreement. The king had the right to exploit its resources, if he followed the laws of the empire and didn't create any harm to Mother Terra and give back to the planet, in one form or the other, what they take from her. But per custom, each planet ultimately belonging to the Aryan Empire will have administrators on it. On the other hand, the Titans promised not to interfere with the king's men so long as they didn't break the universal laws and the simple rules set by the Aryan Empire. Anu became even more furious. He told them he didn't need a police force to babysit him, and as this was his territory, he told the Titans to leave immediately, or if they didn't, it would be looked upon as an act of war. The 7 sisters, tall and stern, looked at the king in silence for a long time, but the king looked back into their eyes without blinking or turning away. Then the sisters stood up from their chairs and left the room. The king and his men were escorted out from the palace of the Titans. Anu was eventually transported back to the mothership by his men and returned to Sirius. He had to let his son, Enlil, take care of this. The king didn't speak to anybody on his way home to his own palace in the Sirius system, he was too angry. War had been declared and a war it would be, he thought. A ferocious war of a kind seldom heard of. Before too long, the Syrian overlords had started great mining operations to extract gold and other precious metals on Terra, a project led by the dictatorial Prince Enlil. The mining showed to be a very lucrative business indeed, and the Syrian overlords were soon trading these very pure and valuable metals with star races all over the universe. Others were building the grandiose palace in King Anu's honor, later housed by Enlil, high up on Mount Olympus. However, the Syrian miners were suffering. The job deep down in the mines was hard and gruesome. No sunlight, bad air, and long work days. Many weren't happy. The supervisors had them dig deeper and deeper for precious metals in the hard, solid rock, and although the result of their work was astonishing, the miners saw very little of the profit land in their own pockets. Many got sick and died in the process, but Enlil saw their workers as dispensable and dug mass graves to get rid of the bodies. Maybe for the reason to provoke a war, the Syrians captured Titans where they could, shot them unconscious, and put them in chain down in the mines to help with the mining process. Under the whip, they had them work even harder than their own people. The administration soon became aware of this and made themselves prepared for the war they knew was inevitable. They called the stars for help. Soon enough, Aryan battleships started showing up in Eridu, putting themselves in position. Syrian battleships were still nowhere to be seen. And down on the planet, the king of the Dog Star started a war against the Titans to get them out of there, a war that according to mythology lasted for 10 years. 3. The Titanomachy. The Titans were hardly taken by surprise after all, they had been warned. So when the first attack on the palace was made by the Syrian Dakh warriors, the Titans were ready to defend themselves. Lord Enlil, however, was a great war strategist, and he had been titled the Lord of the Airways by his father, and he was the right man at the right place. The first strike was fast and ruthless, and although Lord Enlil lost a few warships, he couldn't use hollowed-out craft inside the atmosphere, he made a great damage to the Titan's palace. A first strike was all that was needed for the Aryan armada to interfere. However, as soon as they were going to start acting, a huge armada of planetoids appeared out of nowhere, almost filling the whole solar system. King Anu's Dakh armada from Sirius and other colonies, such as Alpha Draconis, attacked viciously. Still, after millions of years, their hollowed-out planetoids and asteroids worked as incredible battleship. So now, a full-blown war was raging in space outside Terra, and at the same time, a ferocious war was raging down on the planet, too. The mining came to a halt, and the miners put on their armor and started participating in the battle as well. The war was gruesome. The Queen's daughters had a lot of Aryans working for them, both males and females, and they were also trained as defense warriors, known across Sector 9 as ruthless when came to defending themselves or the Empire. So the Titans were certainly not defenseless, so there were lots of casualties on both sides. Although the Aryans were often greater warriors than the Syrians, the latter were much more barbaric. When they had killed or wounded one of the Aryan soldiers, in their usual manner, they ripped them into pieces, drank their blood and ate their flesh while the victims were still alive. Many committed suicide if they saw that there was no other way out. Archaeologists have actually found remnants of old atomic, nuclear wars far back in time. The stones in the soil is showing clear signs of radioactivity way back in the past. However, if Earth was still intact the way it was when the Titanomachy raged, more such sites, showing remnants of radioactivity, would possibly have been found. The Pleiadians also talk about several nuclear wars way back in time, further back than anyone can imagine. So it sounds plausible that nuclear weapons were used in this war as well. In addition, it seems like KHAA energy was used on both sides in the battle. As mythology tells us, Zeus, at the end of the war, used his thunderbolt, lightning from the KHAA, to defeat Typhon, who was attacking Zeus/Enlil for having enslaved the Titans. Typhon, the alleged giant monster, was first defeating Enlil, but was later killed by the same. Metaphorically speaking, this was what happened. 4. The destruction of Terra. The Aryans knew the capacity of the Dakh warriors and the fury with which they fought, but the Aryan Empire had defeated them before and done so quite easily. This was also what was about to happen this time as well. So, when it looked like the Syrians were about to lose the war, King Anu himself decided to participate in the battle, bringing another huge armada of battleships to Eridu in an effort to turn the war around, also including his huge private battleship, the Great Ar, into the battles. When least expected, King Anu arrived with the Great Ar, together with hundreds of hollowed-out asteroids. The battle was now more equal, and the Aryans suffered a lot of losses to begin with. This gave Enlil hope, and bolts of blue lightning flashed from his spacecraft, destroying a lot of Aryan ships, and the Great Ar, fully armed with the most devastating weapons the Syrian Empire could produce, created great damage and havoc in the solar system. Ships were shot down, with their debris drifting in space, and whole battleships were falling down on a planet, above which the battles took place. Anu wanted to make sure he didn't underestimate the Aryan Makh warriors again. The battle was furious and Enlil fought with all his might, blinded by the moments of excitement. He loved the great lightning bolt cannons that his own battleship was equipped with, and fired them off all at once, over and over. When he ceased fire for a moment, he saw a fraction of a hollowed-out craft floating by outside his window. He smiled to himself, thinking it was one of the victims of his intense firing. But suddenly he stopped breathing in fear when he saw what it really was. It was a chunk of his own ship, floating around in space. He was hit, but how badly? Enlil rushed to the control board and looked out on the big screen in front of him. Underneath his ship he saw a huge planet coming closer and closer. He recognized it immediately as Uranus, named after his father, the big planet where advanced scientific experiments were taking place. He was going to hit its atmosphere any moment. Desperately, he tried to steer away, but none of the control mechanisms was working. There was no escape. Enlil's ship hit the big planet at an angle and bounced out in space again. Uranus tilted on its axis as a result of the impact and has since then laid on its side. After had checked it out, Enlil sighed from relief when he found that his ship was not as seriously damaged as he thought it was, and his technicians were already working on fixing the most urgent problems. The prince was soon furiously participating in the battle again, but his ship was harder to maneuver now. He loved the war and he loved to use the absolute newest weaponry in the Syrian arsenal, which was all installed in his huge battleship. He screamed from excitement when he fired off the powerful weapons towards any enemy ship he could see. All of a sudden, one of his MAKH soldiers tapped him on the shoulder and pointed at the huge monitor, which took up the whole wall in front of them. In the confusion of the battle and the amount of ships out there, it was hard to distinguish what was going on. Enlil was busy opening fire towards a group of enemy ships at 3 o'clock and didn't pay attention to what happened at 10 o'clock. The MAKH soldier did, however. Once he'd gotten Enlil's attention, the prince's face got pale and his body froze. At 10 o'clock he saw his father's ship, the Great AR, right above Terra, and it was wobbling out of control. The huge ship was badly damaged, and Enlil could see how his father tried in vain to steer away from the planet. The prince could see the inevitable happen any moment now. Enlil tried to make contact with his father, but got no answer. This was not good. He changed direction and steered towards his father's ship, but was seriously discouraged by his admiral. It was too dangerous. So Enlil could do nothing but to park his ship and watch what was coming next. King Anu was furious when he realized that he was going to lose his ship and that it would crash on the planet. When he realized there was nothing he could do, he and his crew boarded some smaller ships, which were not meant for battle in open space, and certainly not for interstellar travel, but now they worked as lifeboats. In the last moment, they left the Great AR and flew out in space to hopefully be picked up before enemy ships managed to shoot them down. When the citizens of Terra understood what was about to happen, they panicked and scattered all around. Some fled aimlessly, while others desperately fled underground. Most of the magnificent titans were still chained or captured in caves underground and couldn't escape. They had nowhere to go, although the majority knew what was going on. The chaos was indescribable. In the meantime, just before King Anu arrived in the solar system, the Titans had started rebelling against their Syrian slave drivers after some of them had managed to break loose and steal the keys to the chains from a guard. This way they had succeeded in rescuing many of their kind. Silently, they had gathered a team of rebels who successfully attacked the Syrians involved in one of the mining project. However, it was too little, too late. The day of doom was upon them. When the AR closed in on the planet, some caves were filled with water and many divine giants drowned. Others had the cave ceilings and the walls fall in over them, while some found shelter underground, just to find the escape routes being blocked and they got stuck with nowhere to go. They realized what was to come and waited for the impact and for the atmosphere to be destroyed. Suffocation would be inevitable and there was nothing they could do. Their bodies could not be saved, but they knew, of course, that they were immortal souls, and therefore, they feared not. However, legend says that a very few of them fled far enough underground to actually survive the impact. The impact was incredible. The paradise world of Terra exploded and broke into pieces. Approximately half of it broke apart into small asteroids and rocks and later became the asteroid belt, while the other half catapulted out in space, heading in the direction of the Sunday. King Anu was picked up by his son, Enlil, and they both saw the effects of the impact. They were devastated to see their whole planet blown to pieces, and all their people were dead. This was a great loss. But the loss was definitely not the end of the war, although, it was the beginning of the end. In spite of the loss of the Great AR, the Syrians were still in majority, and after a few more ferocious battles, the Aryans had to leave Eridu. For the first time, the Syrians had won a war against the Aryan Empire. But they hoped they would never have to meet them in battle again, at least not until they were much better prepared, because although they won, it was marginal and the war could easily have tipped over in the other direction. So, after allegedly 10 years, the Titans lost the war to the Syrians. The Syrians had Eridu in their grip, but the solar system was seriously damaged. There was hardly any planet which had not had some damage made to it. Terra was split in 2 pieces, and one piece was heading towards the Sun, but would most likely be held back by the gravity of Mars and Venus. From now on, the frequent reports from the Queen Nekt's daughters and the magnificent Namlulu did not arrive in Orion anymore. The administrators and the guardians of the living library had been silenced. No news from Terra reached the Queen of the Stars.